When the Vorthak Imperium, a species that had conquered 43 star systems and enslaved dozens of civilizations, first encountered humanity, they laughed. These pink-skinned bipeds with their primitive technology and fragile bodies seemed like the galaxy's greatest joke. But now, 3 years later, every Vorthak mother whispers the same name to quiet their younglings at night. Uncle Death. They don't say it in mockery anymore. They say it in reverence, in fear, and in a strange kind of love that no xenobiologist could have predicted. Because Uncle Death isn't what the Imperium expected from humanity's first contact. He wasn't a warrior or a diplomat or a scientist. He was just a cargo hauler named Jake Sullivan who happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time, or perhaps, as the Vorthak now believe, exactly where the universe needed him to be. The story begins on Kepler 442b, a mining colony at the edge of human space where Jake was delivering medical supplies. It was supposed to be a routine job: drop the cargo, collect payment, and jump back to Earth before the weekend. But the universe, as Jake would learn, rarely cares about human schedules. Especially when there's a 7-foot-tall alien warrior crying over his dying cub in the middle of a burning forest. See, what the Imperium didn't understand about humans, what no alien species truly grasps until they witness it firsthand, is that we're not logical. We don't calculate odds when someone needs help. We don't stop to consider diplomatic consequences or species barriers or the fact that helping might get us killed. We just act. And sometimes, that illogical, reckless compassion changes everything. Jake Sullivan was about to become the most infamous human in the galaxy, though he'd never intended to be anything more than a man trying to pay his bills. But when a Vorthak cub named Zekh lay dying from smoke inhalation, and when his father, a proud warrior of the Imperium, looked up at Jake with eyes full of desperate hope, something fundamentally shifted in the cosmic balance of power. The aliens called it impossible. They called it primitive. They called it magic. But Jake just called it basic human decency. And that difference in perspective was about to shake the foundations of an empire that had stood unchallenged for 3,000 years. Because here's what the Vorthak discovered that day: humans don't just heal bodies. We heal hearts, minds, and sometimes entire civilizations. We take broken things and make them whole again, not through superior technology or overwhelming force, but through something far more dangerous to tyrants everywhere: the simple, stubborn refusal to let someone suffer when we can help. The Imperium had expected humanity to be like every other species they'd encountered: predictable, rational, motivated by self-preservation and tribal loyalty. They'd prepared for war, diplomacy, trade negotiations, and territorial disputes. They hadn't prepared for a cargo hauler to risk his life for an alien child he'd never met, using nothing but primitive Earth medicine and an unshakable belief that every life has value. That oversight would cost them everything they thought they knew about power, fear, and the nature of strength itself. Because once word spread through the Vorthak homeworlds about what Jake Sullivan had done, about how Uncle Death had looked straight into the eyes of the Imperium's most decorated warrior and seen not an enemy, but a father in pain, nothing would ever be the same. The Imperium's own children would begin asking uncomfortable questions. Their warriors would start hesitating before pulling triggers. Their leaders would discover that fear built on oppression crumbles quickly when replaced by something the Vorthak had never experienced from an alien species: genuine, unconditional compassion. But all of that was still hours away. Right now, in this moment, Jake Sullivan was just a man kneeling in the smoke and ash of a burning forest, looking at a dying alien cub and thinking the most dangerous thought in the galaxy: I can fix this. The mining colony of New Brisbane wasn't much to look at. A collection of prefab buildings clustered around the main extraction site, surrounded by the dense purple forests of Kepler 442b. Jake had been here twice before, both times for routine supply runs. The colonists were good people, mostly engineers and geologists who'd signed 5-year contracts to help establish humanity's foothold in this sector. They paid on time and didn't ask questions about Jake's past, which made them ideal customers in his book. What made this run different was the passenger. Dr. Elizabeth Warren, no relation to the politician, as she was quick to point out, had hitched a ride to study the local ecosystem. She was a xenobiologist from the University of Mars, all sharp angles and sharper questions, the kind of academic who could make a rock formation sound fascinating. Jake normally didn't take passengers, but her research grant paid well enough to make an exception. You know they've detected Vorthak patrol ships in this system, she said as they entered the planet's atmosphere. She was staring out the viewport at the purple forests below, making notes on her tablet. 3 cruisers, just sitting at the edge of the heliosphere. The Colonial Authority thinks it's just reconnaissance, but I'm not so sure. Jake adjusted their descent trajectory, aiming for the landing pad outside New Brisbane's main settlement. Vorthak don't do just reconnaissance. Document. If they're here, they want something. Dr. Warren looked up from her tablet. You sound like you know them personally. Used to haul freight through the neutral zone before the blockade. Ran into their patrols a few times. Jake didn't mention the scars on his left arm or the nightmares that still woke him up sometimes. Some stories weren't worth telling. They're not evil exactly, just different. They see weakness as an invitation to conquest. It's cultural, goes back thousands of years. The landing was smooth, and Jake was busy running through his post-flight checklist when the alarm started. Not the gentle chime of a system notification, but the harsh, urgent wail that meant immediate danger. Through the cockpit window, they could see smoke rising from the forest about 3 kilometers northeast of the settlement. Forest fire, Dr. Warren said, already gathering her equipment. Common this time of year, apparently. The local flora has this accelerant in its sap that... She stopped talking when they saw the ships. 3 sleek Vorthak fighters, their hull plating gleaming black against the purple smoke. They were hovering over the fire, searchlights cutting through the haze. Jake's blood ran cold. They're not fighting the fire. They're looking for something. The settlement's emergency coordinator, a woman named Director Hayes, met them at the landing pad. Her face was grim, and she was clutching a radio that crackled with urgent chatter. Sullivan, perfect timing. We need every ship we can get. There was a diplomatic incident about 6 hours ago. A Vorthak scout ship crashed in the forest, engine failure, we think. The pilot and his cub survived the crash, but now they're trapped by the fire. His cub? Dr. Warren looked confused. Vorthak bring their children on military missions? Apparently this one did. Look, the Imperium is sending a full rescue fleet, but they won't arrive for another 8 hours. The fire will reach the crash site in 2. We've got atmospheric shuttles trying to get close, but the smoke is too thick for our sensors, and the heat is playing havoc with our engines. Jake was already walking back toward his ship. My cargo hauler has military-grade environmental systems. I can get through that smoke. Jake, no. Dr. Warren caught his arm. You just said the Vorthak see weakness as invitation to conquest. What do you think they'll see when you risk your life to save their people? He paused at the cargo ramp, considering. She had a point. The smart play would be to stay grounded, let the Vorthak handle their own rescue, avoid any possibility of creating a diplomatic incident. The safe play, the logical play, but through the smoke and chaos, Jake could hear something that cut straight through all that logic. The sound of a Vorthak warrior calling for help. Not ordering, not demanding, asking. There was desperation in that alien voice, a kind of raw pain that transcended species barriers. You know what they'll see, Doc? Jake fired up the engines, the familiar thrum of power flooding through the ship's systems. They'll see what happens when someone gives a damn. As they lifted off toward the burning forest, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that this moment would be remembered long after the smoke cleared. He just didn't know yet that it would be remembered across an entire empire, or that a simple act of human decency was about to earn him a name that would be spoken in alien languages for generations to come. The ship pushed through the wall of smoke, sensors straining to locate the crash site. Somewhere ahead in that purple hell, a father was watching his child die, and Jake Sullivan was about to prove that sometimes the most dangerous thing in the galaxy is a human who refuses to walk away. The Vorthak scout ship had been sleek once, all curves and predatory angles designed to slip through space like a knife through silk. Now it was a broken bird of prey, crumpled against the base of a massive purple tree, its hull cracked open like an egg. Smoke poured from the wreckage in thick, choking clouds that turned the air itself into a weapon. Jake brought his cargo hauler down as close as he dared, the ship's environmental systems screaming warnings about atmospheric toxicity and heat stress. Through the haze, he could make out two figures beside the wreck. A Vorthak adult in damaged military armor and a much smaller shape lying motionless on the ground. Visual contact, Jake called to Dr. Warren, who was monitoring their life support systems. One adult, one juvenile. The kids not moving. The adult Vorthak looked up at their approaching ship, and even through the smoke and distance, Jake could see the alien's posture change. The warrior's hand moved to his sidearm, then stopped. Jake could almost read the internal struggle. Accept help from an alien, or watch his child die for the sake of pride. Jake activated the external speakers. This is Jake Sullivan of the cargo vessel Lucky Strike. Do you need medical assistance? The response came in heavily accented but clear standard. Human ship. My offspring breathes poison smoke. Your help accepted. That simple phrase, your help accepted, violated about 3,000 years of Vorthak cultural conditioning. In their society, accepting aid from a lesser species was tantamount to admitting defeat, to acknowledging weakness that could never be lived down. But here was a warrior of the Imperium, a soldier trained from birth to view aliens as either subjects or enemies, asking a human for help. Jake powered down and grabbed the emergency medical kit from the cargo hold. As he stepped out into the toxic air, his breathing mask immediately fogged from the heat. The Vorthak warrior was enormous up close, 7 feet tall and built like a living tank, with the distinctive ridge markings that indicated high military rank. But his hands were shaking as he knelt beside the small form on the ground. The cub couldn't have been more than 8 or 9 years old in human terms, though Jake knew Vorthak aged differently. The child's breathing was shallow and labored, his skin taking on a grayish tint that Jake's basic xenobiology training told him meant oxygen deprivation. Smoke inhalation, Jake said, kneeling beside them. How long has he been like this? Since the crash. 1 hour, perhaps more. The warrior's voice cracked. I am Commander Thrak of the 5th Battle Fleet. This is my son, Zekh. He was eager to see new worlds. I brought him to observe the human settlement. Jake opened the medical kit, his hands moving automatically through procedures he'd learned during his brief stint in the Colonial Marines. Basic emergency medicine, nothing fancy, but it might be enough. I'm going to give him oxygen and a stimulant. It's human medicine, but our physiologies aren't that different. You would risk his life on guesswork? Thrak's voice carried a dangerous edge. Jake looked up, meeting the alien's eyes directly. Commander, I'm going to tell you something that might save your son's life. Right now, guesswork is all he's got. The first injection went smoothly enough. Jake administered a mild respiratory stimulant, something designed to help human lungs process contaminated air. Zekh's breathing improved slightly, the grayish tint fading from his skin, but he still wasn't conscious. It's working, Thrak said, and Jake heard something like wonder in the alien's voice. That's when the forest exploded. The fire had been creeping closer while they worked, feeding on the accelerant-rich sap of the purple trees. Now it reached a particularly dense grove about 50 meters away, and the entire section went up like a bomb. The heat wave knocked all 3 of them backward, and suddenly the air wasn't just toxic. It was becoming unbreathable even with masks. We need to move, Jake shouted over the roar of flames. My ship's 20 meters that way. But when they tried to lift Zekh, the young Vorthak cried out in pain. His left leg was twisted at an unnatural angle, broken in the crash, probably, and Jake had been too focused on the breathing issues to notice. I'll carry him, Thrak said, but the commander's own armor was damaged, sparking and smoking from impact damage. The exoskeleton that normally multiplied a Vorthak warrior's strength was now dead weight, and Jake could see the alien struggling under the burden. Give him to me, Jake said. Thrak stared at him. You are small. Yeah, well, small's got advantages. Jake was already calculating angles and leverage points. I can move faster than you in that damaged armor, and my ship's life support is designed for human physiology. If we're going to save him, we need to get him there now. Another explosion lit the forest nearby. The fire was moving faster than any of them had anticipated, turning their careful rescue into a desperate sprint against time. Thrak made a decision that would haunt Vorthak military historians for decades. He handed his son to an alien. Not to a superior officer, not to a fellow warrior, but to a human cargo hauler who weighed about half what the commander's armor alone weighed. Jake took the unconscious cub in his arms and immediately understood why Thrak had hesitated. Zekh was heavier than he looked, and Jake's civilian fitness regime hadn't exactly prepared him for this. But he'd carried wounded Marines through worse conditions, and muscle memory kicked in. "Stay close," he told Thrak. "And if I fall, you grab him and keep moving." They stumbled through the smoke toward the Lucky Strike, Jake's lungs burning despite the breathing mask, his arms already aching from the weight. Behind them, the forest fire roared like a living thing, hungry and relentless. Ahead, salvation waited in the form of a beat-up cargo hauler that had never been designed for heroics. Jake Sullivan was about to discover that heroics aren't about the tools you have. They're about refusing to give up when someone's counting on you. They reached the ship just as Jake's strength gave out. He collapsed at the cargo ramp, still clutching Zekh, his vision graying at the edges from smoke inhalation and exhaustion. Thrak caught them both, his damaged armor whining in protest, and together they stumbled into the ship's clean air. Dr. Warren was waiting with the ship's medical bay prepped and ready. "Get him on the table," she ordered, her academic demeanor replaced by clinical efficiency. "Jake, you look like hell. Sit down before you pass out." But Jake couldn't sit down. Not yet, because as Dr. Warren worked over the unconscious Vorthak cub, checking vitals, administering more oxygen, muttering about xenophysiology and hoping the stimulant wouldn't cause adverse reactions, Jake saw something that made his blood run cold. Through the cockpit window, 3 more Vorthak fighters were descending through the smoke. Not rescue ships, these had the angular, aggressive lines of military interceptors, and they weren't broadcasting on rescue frequencies. "Commander," Jake called to Thrak, who was standing over his son with the kind of helpless intensity that transcended species. "Those your reinforcements?" Thrak looked up, following Jake's gaze. When he saw the approaching ships, his expression hardened into something that was equal parts rage and despair. "No, those are Enforcer Squadron ships. They have orders regarding diplomatic incidents." "What kind of orders?" "The kind that ensure no weakness is shown to alien species." Thrak's hand moved to his sidearm, then stopped. "If they find my son alive because of human intervention, if they discover that I accepted help from aliens." He didn't finish the sentence, but Jake understood. In Vorthak society, accepting help from a lesser species wasn't just embarrassing. It was treasonous. And the penalty for treason was death. Not just for Thrak, but for his family line, including the unconscious cub that Dr. Warren was fighting to save. "So what happens now?" Jake asked quietly. Thrak was quiet for a long moment, watching the Enforcer ships take position around the Lucky Strike. Their weapon systems were powered up, Jake noticed. Not exactly the posture you'd expect from fellow military personnel coming to assist in a rescue operation. "Now," Thrak said finally, "I must choose between my honor and my son's life." The lead Enforcer ship was hailing them, demanding immediate surrender and custody transfer. Through the medical bay's window, Jake could see young Zekh beginning to stir, his breathing steady for the first time since they'd found him. The kid was going to live. The question was whether any of them would live long enough to see it matter. Jake looked at the tactical display, at the 3 ships surrounding them, at the Vorthak warrior torn between duty and love, at the human doctor working frantically to save an alien child. In about 30 seconds, someone was going to have to make a choice that would either start a war or change everything about how 2 species saw each other. He had a feeling that choice was going to be his. The comm channel crackled to life with the harsh, commanding voice of the Enforcer Squadron leader. "Vorthak vessel Lucky Strike, you will immediately transfer custody of Commander Thrak and the juvenile to Enforcement Authority. Compliance is mandatory." Jake keyed the response channel before Thrak could speak. "This is Captain Jake Sullivan of the independent vessel Lucky Strike. I'm afraid we can't comply with that request." The silence that followed was pregnant with disbelief. Dr. Warren looked up from her patient, her face pale. Thrak stared at Jake as if the human had just declared war on the universe itself. Human. The Enforcer leader's voice dripped with contempt. You do not understand the forces you are challenging. Stand down immediately or face obliteration. See, that's where you're wrong, Jake said, settling into the pilot's chair with the kind of calm that comes from making peace with impossible odds. I understand exactly what I'm challenging, and I'm not standing down. He switched to internal ship comms. Doc, how's our patient? Stable, Dr. Warren replied, not looking up from the medical scanners. Zekh is going to be fine thanks to his father's quick thinking in getting him clear of the crash site. Jake interrupted, looking directly at Thrak. That's what happened here, Commander. You saved your son. No human intervention needed. Thrak's eyes widened as he understood what Jake was offering. A lie that would preserve his honor, maintain Vorthak cultural integrity, and keep everyone alive. All Jake had to do was delete the rescue from official record, pretend it never happened, and let the Imperium believe their warrior had handled everything alone. It was the smart play, the safe play, the logical play. Jake opened a new channel, not to the Enforcer ships, but to New Brisbane Colony's emergency frequency. A frequency that was automatically logged and transmitted to colonial administration on Earth. A frequency that would create an official record of everything that was about to be said. This is Jake Sullivan, commanding the civilian vessel Lucky Strike, he said clearly. At approximately 1,400 hours local time, I provided emergency medical assistance to a Vorthak juvenile suffering from smoke inhalation. The child's father, Commander Thrak of the 5th Battle Fleet, requested this aid after a ship crash trapped them in a forest fire. The Enforcer leader's voice cut through the channel. Human, you will cease this transmission immediately. Jake continued as if he hadn't heard. I administered basic respiratory stimulants and oxygen therapy using standard colonial marine emergency protocols. The patient responded well to treatment and is expected to make a full recovery. Commander Thrak showed exceptional courage in protecting his son during the rescue operation, and his cooperation was instrumental in saving the child's life. Through the cockpit window, Jake could see the weapon systems on all 3 Enforcer ships charging to full power. They were going to fire. In about 10 seconds, the Lucky Strike and everyone aboard would be reduced to ionized atoms. But something strange was happening on Thrak's personal communicator. It was lighting up with incoming transmissions. Dozens of them, then hundreds. Personal messages from across the Vorthak fleet, from ships that had been monitoring colonial frequencies as part of standard intelligence gathering. Commander Thrak, one message began in the guttural tones of the Vorthak language. Is it true that a human risked his life to save young Zekh? Another voice, older. The human spoke of your courage, warrior. He honored you before his own people. And another, tell us of this Jake Sullivan who calls himself small but carries our children through fire. Jake couldn't understand the words, but he could read Thrak's expression as the alien listened. Wonder, confusion, and something that might have been the beginning of hope. The Enforcer leader was losing patience. Final warning, human vessel. Prepare for. Belay that order. Thrak's voice cut across the channel with absolute authority. This is Commander Thrak of the 5th Battle Fleet. I am invoking code 77 Alpha. The silence that followed was profound. Dr. Warren looked confused, but Jake had heard enough about Vorthak military protocol during his freight runs to know what code 77 Alpha meant. Formal challenge to superior authority based on questions of honor. When the Enforcer leader spoke again, his voice was tight with barely controlled rage. Commander, you cannot be serious. I invoke the ancient right, Thrak said formally. This human, Jake Sullivan, has acted with honor toward my family. He showed courage in the face of danger, risking his life for one not of his species. By Vorthak law, such actions must be acknowledged, not punished. On the medical table, young Zekh stirred and opened his eyes. The first thing he saw was his father's face, and he managed a weak smile. The second thing he saw was Jake Sullivan, the human who had carried him through fire. Papa? Zekh whispered in accented standard. Is this Uncle Death? The question hung in the air like a revelation. Jake had no idea what the kid meant, but Thrak's expression suggested it was significant. Very significant. "Yes, my son," Thrak said quietly. "This is Uncle Death, the one who steals children from dying and gives them back to life." Jake was going to ask what that meant, but the comm channel erupted with chatter from across the Vorthak fleet. Apparently, Uncle Death was a figure from Vorthak folklore, a mythical being who appeared in their darkest hour to save their young, someone who cared nothing for politics or power, only for protecting the innocent. The enforcer ships were pulling back, their weapon systems powering down. The fleet-wide transmission revealed something the enforcement squadron couldn't fight. An entire battle fleet beginning to see Jake Sullivan not as a diplomatic incident, but as the fulfillment of ancient legend. Jake Sullivan had just accidentally become the most important human in Vorthak history, and he still didn't have a clue what he'd gotten himself into. 3 hours later, Jake sat in the Lucky Strike's galley, nursing a cup of coffee and trying to process what had just happened. Zekh was fully recovered and playing some kind of holographic game with Dr. Warren, chattering excitedly about Earth animals and asking if all humans could steal cubs from fire. Commander Thrak stood at the viewport, watching his fleet take defensive positions around New Brisbane colony. "So," Jake said finally, "Uncle Death." Thrak turned, and Jake was surprised to see something like amusement in the alien's expression. An old story, passed down through generations. It speaks of a guardian who appears when Vorthak young are in mortal danger. Someone who cares nothing for species, politics, or personal gain. Only for the safety of children. Sounds like a nice story. It was only a story, until today. Thrak approached the table and, in a gesture that would have scandalized Vorthak society 6 hours earlier, sat down across from a human as an equal. "Jake Sullivan, you have given me back my son. But more than that, you have given my people something we had forgotten. The knowledge that strength can show itself through mercy, and that honor comes not from dominance, but from protecting those who cannot protect themselves." Through the viewport, they could see the Vorthak fleet repositioning again. Not in attack formation, but in what Dr. Warren had identified as a protective perimeter around the human colony. "So what happens now?" Jake asked. "Now," Thrak said. "Word spreads through the Imperium about Uncle Death and his medicine that steals cubs from dying. Now my people begin to ask questions they have never asked before. If humans show such honor to alien children, what else have we misunderstood about them? And now," he paused, looking at his son. "Now everything changes." Jake's communicator chimed with an incoming message from Colonial Administration. Then another, and another. Within minutes, it was flooded with transmission requests from news networks, government officials, and what appeared to be every cargo hauler in human space wanting to know about the Sullivan incident. "I think I'm going to need a bigger ship," Jake muttered. Dr. Warren looked up from her game with Zekh. "Jake, do you realize what you've done? You've just initiated first peaceful contact between humanity and the Vorthak Imperium. This is going to reshape interstellar politics for centuries." Jake looked at the young Vorthak cub, who was showing Dr. Warren how to make his holographic tiger do backflips, and at Commander Thrak, who was composing what appeared to be a very long message to his superiors. Then he looked out at the defensive formation of alien warships that were now protecting a human colony they'd come to reconnoiter. "Yeah," he said finally, "but right now, I'm just glad the kid's okay." And somewhere across the galaxy, in nurseries and training grounds and the private quarters of mighty warships, Vorthak parents were beginning to tell their children a new story, not of conquest or dominance, but of a human called Uncle Death, who proved that sometimes the greatest strength is knowing when to help instead of harm. But that's not the end of Jake Sullivan's story, because word of Uncle Death was spreading beyond the Vorthak Imperium, reaching species that had never heard of humans, carrying with it a dangerous new idea. That maybe, just maybe, these strange creatures from Earth offered something the galaxy had never seen before: compassion without condition, courage without conquest, and the radical belief that every life, no matter how alien, has value worth risking everything to protect. In our next story, you'll discover what happened when Jake Sullivan's reputation reached the hive mind collective of the Zephyrian Empire, and why they started calling him the one who thinks alone. Because apparently, teaching an entire species about individual worth can be just as dangerous as saving their children, and twice as rewarding.